All right, should I just get started?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, um, this evening, if you're on the East Coast. But this session is going to be about prospect research. This is something that's very foundational if you want to scale your nonprofit. And in this session, you will learn how, and you'll also get the opportunity to apply it a little bit yourself during the session. So, without any further ado, just really quick, my name is Josef Castanedaliles. I have been doing prospect research and prospect management for almost 15 years at this point, at Santa Clara University in the Bay Area. Um, I have a PhD in sociology. Um, One of my areas was research methods, another was racial and ethnic identity. And I am the proud father to Lupita, who is just started at the University of Southern California. We were there just last week, moving her in, and I'm still recovering from that. But anyways, I will go ahead and get started. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, and just give me a moment to adjust this. There we go. I think we got it. All right, so hopefully everyone can see the screen here. So again, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the power of prospect research. And as always, if you have any questions, just go ahead and put those in the chat or feel free to call them out as you have them. And of course, there should be some additional time at the end for any questions or comments that you may have. Um, Everything is helpful. It helps me to improve my presentation. So yeah, I would appreciate any questions or comments you have. So as we're getting into this, ask yourself a couple of questions. First and foremost, how well do you know your donors? And more importantly, which donors can step up to a higher level of giving than what they're currently doing? Who are your major donors, however you define a major gift? Who are the donors that can make a difference? And in some cases, maybe in all of your cases, do you need to find new prospective donors? So if you find it difficult to answer these questions, don't worry. Prospect research is the tool that you need to strengthen your nonprofit. So what is prospect research? So prospect research is a process that's used by nonprofits to gather information about donors or potential donors to inform your strategy and your pipelines. What we're talking about when we're mentioning prospect research is wealth indicators, professional history, giving to other nonprofits, um, board service, and other volunteer involvements. So when we talk about prospect research, we're going to talk about two key concepts. We're going to talk about both capacity, which is a level which a donor can give over 5 years, and inclination towards giving, because they may have the capacity to give, but they may not actually give to your nonprofit, or they may not be philanthropically inclined. So it's important to determine that. So prospect research is essential to build a major gift pipeline, which is what all nonprofits ideally should be working on if you don't have one. It's important to do that to segment your database, who's annual, who's major, etc., and developing a strategy for your nonprofit. So let's do that deep dive into prospect research. So first of all, again, I mentioned capacity. And capacity usually draws upon this concept of net worth, right? Capacity is based on an estimation of a prospect's net worth, which typically we're using an estimate of 5% of what we can estimate over 3 to 5 years. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But knowing anyone's net worth completely is impossible. In particular, wealthier people can hide their properties. In everybody's cases, fortunately, we can never confirm what's in a bank account. If you're able to see that, they're able to see into yours. So fortunately, we don't have that information. So what do we do as prospect researchers? We identify the wealth indicators that we can find or estimate, add those values together, and then calculate a percentage of assets. Again, typically 5% over a number of years to estimate giving capacity. We'll have one example to follow, and then we'll also, again, dive into it a little bit ourselves, I bet. So capacity involves wealth indicators. In most cases, for most people, your most valuable asset is your real estate. Your residential real estate, but of course there are some that may own commercial real estate or agricultural, etc. With real estate, again, we're typically looking at market value. And we try to estimate that for commercial or agricultural. Sometimes that's a little more challenging. Of course, another source of capacity is salary. In most cases, we have to estimate that, but there are some rare instances where you can find exact compensation for those that are like basically the 1% of the 1% of executives, which would be called named executive officers at publicly traded companies. We can estimate this for some government employees, and there are some websites like Open Payrolls that help us find that information. And of course, some nonprofit executives. This is disclosed in their 990 documents, with which I'm sure you're familiar. But in a lot of cases, we may also just estimate salary doing Google searches or using certain databases. Stock is another source. Again, we can rarely find out exactly this amount except for certain people like executive officers, board members, family foundations. Obviously that some may have family foundations, and business valuation, which is very tricky, and I'll get into that. But sometimes we have to try to figure out, can we estimate something about a private business's revenue or assets, etc. So I'm going to talk very briefly about wealth screenings. So if you have a sizable database and your budget allows, of course, there are various third-party vendors that can do capacity screenings of either part of your database or in some cases, all of it. Wealth screenings will provide an estimate of a donor's capacity on the various assets that they could detect. Usually it's based on real estate. In some cases, there's a proprietary formula they may use to determine salary based off of whatever information they have. And capacity estimate is based on a percentage of assets. It's usually 5% of the total. The pro is obvious. This can save you some time. It's faster than do it yourself. The cons, of course, also obvious. It can be expensive. And of course, what some databases are not great at doing is distinguishing your prospects from others. So if you have a fairly common name, whether it's like a John Smith or could be like a Robert Gonzalez or some other name that would be fairly common, the database sometimes trouble distinguishing that. So then you have to go in and determine, which assets are actually belonging to your prospect as opposed to somebody else not related to your organization at all. Some CRMs may also come with some wealth screening software as well. So again, many packages are pretty much out of reach for a lot of nonprofits. These are two that I'm familiar with. One is called MPO Authority. This is geared towards smaller nonprofits. And the packages, I understand, starts at about $1,700 to do just one-off screenings. But if you want a batch screen, a total of 1,000 records, that's about $1,800. iWave, and I think this number may be accurate. It kind of varies, but it's usually in this range of like above $3,500, 3,500 to 3,700. You have unlimited one-off screenings. You can search. You can do an individual search for giving, but it doesn't allow a batch screening. The one thing is nice is that if you have like several thousand prospects, you can screen them one by one, but That, of course, is also time consuming, but it does have that element of being able to do foundation, basically searching foundation giving or individual giving. Yes, there's a question.
Yes, my name's Karina. I'm in New Jersey. So I just have a question about those two companies. Do
Uh-huh.
they screen your like the donors you already have, or are they doing the research to find prospective donors for you?
Um, well, let's see. I'm not sure about MPO authority. iWave, I think you could do both. I think you could actually search for individual donors. Um, the experience I have, we actually have like the larger nonprofit package. Um, but you can just put like, let's say if you have a name and a city, you could search these donors that may not be part of your database, and it could come up with options, or again, if it's a fairly unique name, it could actually identify that particular prospect. So they don't have, for iWave anyways, they don't have to be prospects that are in your database.
Gotcha. Okay. And one more follow-up question. I don't know if you're going to
Sure.
answer this later in the presentation. So right now, a lot of our donors are like corporate donors, like banks, law firms, real estate agencies. And they're usually even hospitals, they're usually contributing like sponsorship for events.
Hmm.
Um, so what would it look like transitioning? And if you're gonna answer this later on, that's okay. Because a lot of the money that gets donated is coming from the company, right? Not the individual who's attending the
Right.
events and supporting or volunteering. So where do you make that switch, or how do you make that switch to find people who are kind of giving money from their own pocket? At least like on the major gifts end.
Right. I mean, there are a number of possibilities, and we'll get a little more into this.
Okay,
But
thank you.
but I mean, one of the things that I do, so say for example, I'm using iWave. Um, yeah, well, I could talk about two things. I could talk about, the sort of low cost way, and I could refer to using iWave, for example. But one of the things that I try to understand, if you have to do like no low cost or no cost, is just trying to understand like peer organizations. Those are kind of doing work that is similar to yours, and who's giving to those if their donor roles are disclosed. Say, for example, they have annual reports. Be kind of curious about like who's giving to similar organizations, and could these be prospects that might also be motivated to give to my organization. Um, if you have something like iWave, you can actually search by the type of cause that people are giving to, and you can narrow it down to like the state and like the metropolitan region or the city. So if, like, let's say somebody is giving to something related to climate change, you could just search climate change for, New York, New York, for example, and you could see donors according to donor roles that are giving to those types of organizations and at what levels and what years. So that's kind of like the power of those databases. You could do the same thing with a lot of creative Google searches, um, but obviously that's going to take some time. But if you don't have the money to allocate towards like a yearly subscription for a database, that is one method of doing it. The other thing, of course, if you have a lot of corporate donors, is there a way to tap into some of the networks within those corporations, like ERGs, for example? Um, are there certain advocates within those organizations that can then leverage your networks that in turn become donors to your nonprofit? Does that is that helpful?
It helps. We actually do tap into the ERGs, but what we've noticed recently is that like we're a Puerto Rican kind of cultural institute. So given like a lot of the DEI policies, a lot of ERGs have been dismantled or are kind of like flying under the radar.
Mm.
So it's just difficult times, you know. But you, yeah, answered my question, so thank you.
And that's something I'm glad you brought that up. That's something that I hadn't really thought about with regard to ERGs, and these are terrifying times all over, but just that concept as well that, you know, corporations are now starting to dismantle their ERGs because of fear of reprisal is something that is truly horrible.
Yeah, I actually was about to begin a great partnership with an ERG at BMW, and it totally fell through. They had to dismantle the whole thing because they have government contracts. So,
Just to answer a question that came up in the chat. So an ERG is an employee resource group. Um, so, I mean, these are essentially networks within companies where people can come together, off of the basis of shared identity. Some of it focuses on racial or ethnic identity, but not always the case. Some ERGs are organized according to, sexual orientation, religious identity, and others. So there's actually a range of, maybe I should say, what used to exist in some companies, a range of different ERGs. Um, and again, it's yeah, some employee resource groups. Um, but again, it's terrifying to think just how deep this administration is going in terms of its influence on higher education, corporations, and so forth. Um, Talk a little bit about ERGs in a little bit too with regard to LinkedIn. But let me go ahead and move forward with regard to some of the low-cost resources when we start looking at these wealth indicators. So one that has come up recently for me that's been introduced by another colleague, this one is definitely one to check out. It's called melissa.com. So this is good as a person search or a property search. So say, for example, if you are prospecting, donors to other peer organizations that, and even just in general might be like peers, not necessarily your specific focus, but say you're curious about donors in your area giving to organizations that focus on poverty alleviation, for example. Um, so you find some names and then you could use melissa.com to actually do a person search just to get a sense of, what might be a type of property that they own and what that capacity might be. Melissa.com is not a free resource, it's a low-cost resource. Basically, what you do is you buy credits that you use up, and the credits cost differently depending on the search. But this overall is like a pretty good strong database. It's not quite like an iWave, but this one is more like a pay as you go. And so if you want to search like a handful of names, I think it's pretty helpful. Um, Another one is called NetR Online, which provides links to county assessors' office sites. And so you can find like ownership information for individual properties. I believe it costs $3.50 per search. But this is if you want to confirm if somebody owns a property. Now, if these are your donors, then it may just be, you could look up their properties on Zillow, right? Which is what I have right below. Um, Commercial real estate, that's a little bit more of an advanced topic, but you may have somebody that is in property management, for example, and they may own several properties. So if they are selling a property, you can find that value on LoopNet. The other thing that you can do is if they're not selling their properties, you could find maybe comparables in the area and get a sense of what their real estate might be valued at. And then every state has a Secretary of State business search. So these are good for finding LLCs, which are limited liability corporations. So basically most businesses are LLCs or LLPs, limited liability partnerships. But what some wealthy people might do is they might roll their property in an LLC, give it some sort of creative name, and pay whatever is the cost per year to the state in order to maintain that LLC. But if you're doing some property searches and you find something that looks kind of interesting, but it's not under their name, but say it's like my property LLC or whatever they've decided to call it, you can look up obviously where it is, whatever state it's in, and use the Secretary of State business search to see if their name is tied to that LLC. So these are just some tips that certainly I use on a day-to-day basis. All right, professional information, of course, LinkedIn. Hopefully everybody has a LinkedIn account. If not, please get one. Why is this important? A lot of it's pretty obvious. Obviously you see who you're connected to. If you have a board, who they are connected to, you can figure out, what your networks are, and you might be surprised who knows whom. Obviously, if you're doing prospecting, you can confirm somebody's employment if they have a LinkedIn account. And of course, what we were talking about just a little bit earlier, volunteer involvement, ERGs to the extent that they may exist within a company still, or people may just simply disclose causes that they care about. I mean, this has really become much more social media since it's evolved from what initially seemed sort of like putting a resume online. Now it's actually social media. Of course, not everybody may have a LinkedIn account. I use Google a lot. Um, Employment may be listed on a company site if they don't have a LinkedIn account. Um, there may be other resources you may find, like Zoom info, for example. Um, Obviously, with LinkedIn, in some cases, it may disclose contact information. That tends to be less common. If you have prospects that are attorneys, though, typically they have their own page on a website. Typically, they have their email disclosed. So lawyers are sometimes the easiest searches to do. But what's cool about LinkedIn is sometimes you're surprised at what people will share on their personal profile. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just go over a couple of lines. He talks about, I didn't come from a traditional background. I grew up helping my dad with construction jobs. Um, Coming from a small farm town and being a child of immigrant farm workers, I didn't have a background in business or tech, but I bring the skills I grew up learning every day. Um, he talks about like how he's a community college graduate. And then last but not least, talks about how he's very passionate about helping his Latinx community, as well as sustaining efforts and getting more Latinos outdoors. And then he's always looking for volunteer events and finding out ways to help the planet. My gosh, in these three paragraphs, he's giving you a sense of who he is, how he identifies, and what his passions are. And then he wants to volunteer. So if there's a nonprofit where they align with what he's disclosed, this is a person I would definitely try to reach out to. But again, it's amazing what people will share on LinkedIn. Sometimes you could find volunteer examples. If they, for example, served on a board or are serving on a board, past or current board service indicates that obviously, they're interested in being involved in nonprofits, but also that they may give to nonprofits. So if I look at this prospect, for example, and see they served on, two boards, I'm going to be curious, are they giving to these nonprofits? And if so, can I find out how much they're giving? So aside from, identifying professional information, if you found somebody's employment, you want to try to estimate their salary as best as you can. So there are any number of websites that are out there. Again, LinkedIn can provide some information as well as Glassdoor, salary.com, and others. The way that I typically start, if I know somebody's employment, is by Googling a job title with the salary and region. So software engineer salary, LA. So I compare different salary estimates, and sometimes they do kind of vary. So sometimes I might try to dig in a little bit more. If I know that maybe they're a senior software engineer, put in senior software engineer, or you could put in maybe something specific that they may have on their LinkedIn profile. But, if I know this person has quite a bit of experience, if they're definitely going like 5, 10 plus years beyond of experience, I really want to go with the higher estimate. And in general, it's like, yeah, it may be slightly too high, perhaps, but it just goes into how you should plan and ask, right? shoot for the stars, right? Shoot higher than lower. And you could have a situation where, maybe it's too high, but then they consider something that is still significant for your organization. Or they may not blink at all, which means they could obviously, you know, make that level a gift. Maybe they can make a higher level. So I would always start with shooting higher than lower. Um, you can use the jobs function on LinkedIn to search for job listings. Some will list salary ranges, particularly if you're in the state of California, because I think that is the law. Um, there are some specific resources. If somebody's involved in finance and legal positions, and Robert Half Salary Guide, which is free, can provide you with specific industries, and it can drill down specifically by location. Metropolitan locations, but you can still drill down by the nearest metropolitan location and get some estimates based on the number of years of experience. So there are a bunch of other resources that are out there. And I'd also like to share a list that I use. So maybe I'll send that over to Pavel afterwards. So that way you also have access to these other resources. So these are just a few. If somebody has a government salary, hopefully they still have a position within government. If they do, there's openpayrolls.com, which provides you access to 100 million records. So if you type in a name, you might actually be able to see somebody's salary for a recent year. I think we have a question. Okay, yeah, we'll do. So other compensation resources, I mentioned this before. GuideStar and ProPublica are free resources that provide 990s for nonprofits. Obviously, it's helpful if you're researching something like a family foundation, you can go directly to that 990. And if they work for a large nonprofit, you might be able to see the highest paid employees from the nonprofits. Typically, it's those that make a certain level and above that are disclosed. There are some private company executive compensation resources. So one is chiefexecutive.net, another one is Thrive, third one is CFO's salary. These provide some very general ranges, and some of them are kind of old. But they also sometimes provide some white papers that you can look at, which gives you a sense of their compensation. So a key thing to note when we talk about CEO compensation, particularly when there's this debate about CEO compensation, a lot of the focus is on public CEO compensation, which is significantly higher than private company executive compensation. In fact, I think in general, I think there was this one study done in 2020, which said that private company executive compensation is about 40% of public company executive compensation. So that's quite a difference. So those working for private companies may be making significantly less. Of course, that may be different if it's a family-owned enterprise. They still might be making a lot. Okay, so again, I talked private versus public. We're going to actually use an example of this in a little bit. So if somebody is a named executive officer of a publicly traded company, you will be able to find them in what's called a proxy statement. These exist on the investor relations section on a corporate site. So it will do this, but what you have to do is you have to look for SEC filings and you look for the latest proxy statement, which may be 2024. It depends on when they have their annual shareholder meeting. Sometimes those are very late in the year. But you can download the latest one. It's called a DEF 14A. And you can look up various tables. One of the most helpful is the summary compensation table. This you can actually see the salary, the bonus, the stock awards, and the base compensation for named executive officers, including the total that they made in a given year. Typically, they'll provide the last 3 years. So you can even just calculate a sort of quick and dirty 3-year average. Sometimes you might see wild variation. A lot of times there's going to be some similarity, give or take a million, right? When you get to those levels, then, A million could still be like, a fairly small difference. You can also find compensations for board members. You can find stock ownership and so forth. And again, this may or may not be relevant to your nonprofit, but eventually you may have somebody that is a named executive officer, and you can really find details about their compensation. There's also another resource called the Edgar Company Filing Search on sec.gov, which allows you to see full text search of filings going back, I think at least 20 years or so, maybe a little bit more than that, but I don't think earlier than 2000. Okay, we're going to talk about a challenging topic because I still wrestle with that, and I would imagine, I'm sure Pavel would echo me on this. This is very difficult to determine. When you look at a public business, for example, you can find, their market capitalization. You can get an estimate of how they are valued in the market in terms of number of millions or billions, right? And then you can see compensation for certain officers. But if you have a private business, they don't have to disclose anything. And typically they don't. So if you have somebody that has a private business and they're known in the area, you know, you have to just sort of grapple with what you can find, right? Do they have a web page? Do they provide information about annual revenue, number of employees? Is your prospect, a founder, right? Do they own business properties? You can Google things like revenue and ranking because sometimes a business may show up on a local business or an industry list. The other thing that I would do, which I think is actually just helpful in general, if you live near a major metropolitan area, you might look into a subscription to the business journals. I think that's between $80 to $100 a year for a digital subscription. But they have journals for 45 cities in the United States and Canada. And what's valuable about them is they often rank leading businesses and they provide revenue and they provide, who are their top executives or CFO or CEO, et cetera, right? And of course, use your local library to see if they have a subscription to the business journal. There are other resources like Dun and Bradstreet or Privco that also provide what are typically estimates on a business's revenue. And if they're a top executive, maybe you could look at, can I estimate at least maybe a 1 to 2% of the revenue per year? That might be an estimate of, what they are making. The other thing that you could do is you could use two resources in tandem, right? So earlier I provided you with some websites that provide, some estimates of what like CEOs and CFOs might be making based on the revenue of the company. So if you can kind of get an estimate of the revenue of the company, you could take that, you could visit those sites, and then kind of get a sense of what the quote unquote take home compensation might be for that particular private business executive. Again, it's going to be a rough estimate. It gives you a sense of, are you really dealing with a major gift prospect as far as your organization is concerned? Just really quick, family foundations, of course, you can use GuideStar or ProPublica to actually find their 990 documents to see both assets and, of course, what they are giving and who they're giving to. What nonprofits are they giving to? Are they types of organizations that are similar to yours in scope and focus? So this is becoming less popular to open a family foundation precisely because donor advised funds have become a lot more popular. And why is that? Well, you don't have quite the administration fees to continue to operate a family foundation. You don't have the auditing responsibilities and so forth. You could give this to any sort of staff administrator like, Fidelity or like maybe a local community foundation. Um, Mine's blanking on some other ones, possibly Prudential, but there or Charles Schwab, but there are any number of organizations that will help you open a donor advised fund, right? Of course, the problem with that is we typically don't know if somebody has a donor advised fund, what they have in it. We're just not going to know that. If we're lucky, we might know how much they need to establish one. Maybe 50,000, 100,000, a million. This may be disclosed by that particular organization that manages the DAFs. So minimum, you might just know what they have to, how much they have to have in assets to open one. The point is, though, if a donation is coming through Fidelity, Charles Schwab, Vanguard, local or faith-based community foundation, you know that's an indication of capacity. In 2023, and there was probably an updated number for this, the average DAF had $141,000 in it. So obviously what that means is that there's clearly some capacity there. So we've talked a little about trying to estimate capacity using things like real estate, salary, stock, other things, private business ownership, that type of thing. So this is to help you in general kind of determine, does somebody have capacity? But just because they have the capacity doesn't mean that they necessarily give. So what would be helpful to know if we can determine this is, does a prospect have a history of giving to other organizations if they're not already giving to yours? Now, if they are giving to yours, or if they're a prospect that's attended an event or is a board member, right? But they're not giving, or they're not giving a lot, could they be giving at a higher level to another organization as compared to yours? So this is why we want to determine the inclination to give. So there's one resource out there that's free, but they limit the number of searches. This is called DS Giving, which is provided by Donor Search. And this does allow 10 free searches. And then afterwards, they have a little pop-up saying, like, we'd like to get to know you, which means that they would like you to talk with the sales rep. Now, you can feel free to do that. I don't know exactly how much it would take to subscribe to Donor Search platform. This is follow-up research that I want to do and provide to all of you members of Somos. But that is the one free resource that is out there. But the other thing I like to do, let me go back to what I was saying earlier a moment ago. You know, if somebody has a LinkedIn profile and you see that they are a board member, obviously, you know, go to that particular website and see if they've disclosed their annual reports and see if they've disclosed if they're giving or not to that nonprofit, and if so, how much. But the other thing that I do, and again, I have access to, in my day job, a number of different very expensive databases, but even those don't necessarily capture all the giving. Do yourself a favor, Google is free. Put in the prospect's name and use words like, in quotes, giving, gift, donation, endowment, scholarship. Because those searches, and I've actually had this happen to me, I've used a database and found that a prospect, you know, according to donor rolls, has only given like $20,000 to an organization. Put that name in Google and endowment, and lo and behold, they made $1 million in gift to establish an endowment to their alma mater, right? So just doing the Google search, I found a dramatic difference between what I found in the paid database. And then with the Google search, I had a very different understanding of this person's inclination to give. They can give at the 7-figure level. Now, they might be motivated to do that because they have that emotional connection to their college, but still, they give at that level. So that could be a very different conversation that I would advise my gift officer to have. And again, I talked about the review of social media pages to see if the prospect is giving to nonprofits that they've been involved in. Just really quick, political giving is often easier to find, but this is the challenge with political giving. Now, who knows if this ruling is going to change, but at least according to now, the Federal Election Commission has stated that information about individual contributors cannot be used for soliciting charitable contributions. Naturally, of course, the FEC has contradicted itself. Whether prospect research has fallen under this is murky, but I belong to an organization called APRA, and our official position is that political giving cannot be used in prospect research. That is our position given this ruling, because we understand that potentially, if there's some evidence that a nonprofit has recorded this information in their database about any individuals, that nonprofit could be in trouble. So the bottom line is it is best not to use that information, even though it has been extremely helpful. So you've gotten a little sense about giving. You've gotten a little bit of sense about capacity for some of your prospects. But you may need contact information, particularly if they're new. But of course, also there might be prospects that need updated contact information. I deal with that on a daily basis in my job. There are two resources. I've used both. One is called Rocket Reach. I'm currently using this now. It's good for 5 free searches. A LinkedIn account is not required for the user or for the prospect. You can type in a name, you can drill down by city, state, etc., even if you know the job, right? Or you can just put the LinkedIn link and drop that in the search bar and see what comes up. But here's the thing, it's relatively inexpensive. It's $69 a month, and I think it's about for 80 lookups. So if you do have a number of prospects where you need to look up that contact information, what you can do is just get a 1-month subscription and just attack it, right? Just get as much as you need, use that up as much as possible. It is a use it or lose it type of thing. So unless you have like an annual subscription, but those tend to be more expensive. The other one is Contact Out, which kind of rides like a Google Chrome extension. You do need a LinkedIn account, and your prospects need a LinkedIn account. You can get 4 free emails per day, but I think there's a cap at 40. Definitely at a certain point, you will have a contact from the sales representative. And it's also $99 a month for 500 work emails. So if you have quite a lot to look up for a particular month, you get work emails and phone numbers. So that, again, might work for 1 month or a couple months, depending on how much you need to look up. All right, so I talked a lot. We're just going to do a sample rating, and then I believe, yeah, we're going to dive right into an example that we're all going to try out. So let's talk about a sample rating. I've talked about capacity ratings. So I'm going to walk you through one, and then I'm going to talk about what all this means. So we've got this false prospect, somebody I made up, Dr. Arturo Velasquez, who is an invasive cardiologist, who's given, I think it's like 500 to your nonprofit each year the past 3 years. So this is somebody who lives in the Bay Area. Sorry, I'm using a Bay Area example. So he's got a nice home in Saratoga valued at about 4 million. Yeah, it's very expensive up here. Compensation, let's say the average salary has been 527,000 based off of salary.com search. You might find some variability there, but that's the estimate that I found. Going his LinkedIn profile, I found that he was a past board member of Siren, which is an immigrant rights organization. And he gave $10,000 according to a donor roll a couple of years ago when he was on the board. So what does all this mean? So what I've been able to determine is his real estate, which is 4 million. Didn't really know if he has a mortgage on it, but given the age of this prospect, he likely owns it outright or he has a very small mortgage. And then we multiply his salary over 5 years. So roughly 500,000. So it's going to be over 2.5 million, but I've used that as our estimate here. So capacity is 4 million plus 2.5 million equals a total of 6.5 million. Then we multiply this total estimate by 5% or 0.05. So what this is going to give us is a range of 250,000 plus. What this means is this is capacity to give to any nonprofit over 5 years. If you want to derive a 1 year estimate, simply divide that by 5 and you get 50,000 plus. So if you wanted to ask him a gift for 1 year, it could be 50,000 plus. But over 5 years, say you want to get him into a pledge, that would be $250,000. And of course, that's the capacity. This is sort of like your starting point. Does it mean that he's going to give it at that level? We don't know. You have to have that conversation. But the strategy is here. You may have looked at him at a certain way as this nice, reliable annual donor. But you look at him now, and just about for any nonprofit, this is going to be a major gift prospect. So you know that your strategy has to change. Maybe you've been sending him emails. Instead, try to secure a meeting. Meet with him, get to know him, get to know why he gives to your nonprofit. So the reason why there typically is that 5 year rating is that I think this borrows from the pledge. And it borrows from the fact that most larger nonprofits will have campaigns in some form, which may last like 5 to 7 years. This may not be as useful for you, but what I would advise to do is start with a 5 year formula and then carve that up however you see fit. Start with a 5 year formula, divide that by 5 if only a year's capacity rating is useful for you. But let's have a little fun. All right, it's your turn. So Google Maria Martinez Cisco. So what can we learn from a simple Google search? Let's start with question number 1. So if anybody has it, just feel free to shout it out.
She's got
Yes, Melody.
Oh, sorry. She's from San Francisco, California, former Chief Operating Officer of Cisco Systems.
All right. Sounds pretty important. And Cisco is a multi-billion-dollar company. So we know that. So former, okay, that's a key thing to know. But and again, I joked about this the last time I did this, that if she pays attention to her LinkedIn at all, she's gonna wonder why like suddenly 20 people looked at her LinkedIn. But go ahead and look at her LinkedIn. So we know that she worked at Cisco. That's in the past, but
She's
we
in
might still
Tyson
be able
now.
to find. What's that?
She's in Tyson now.
Yeah, she is on the board of Tyson. And where else?
And McKesson.
And McKesson.
I didn't even go into the LinkedIn. I just started going, and the board. And the board.
Just the first page, right?
Just the first page, and that she had a, I call it the American Dream conversation that she did the in YouTube. So it's like, she sits down on then like giving of time.
Yes. So we know a little bit. So clearly she serves on, and we're not going to necessarily look into the boards. We can, Tyson and McKesson are both publicly traded companies. So if you wanted, feel free. It's publicly available information. You can look into the proxy statement and see how much stock, she's received. Because typically they also get a cash compensation every year that they serve on a board. You can dive into that. Her past Cisco compensation is certainly very exciting, and we'll get into that in just a second. Does she serve on any nonprofit boards? We know she serves on some corporate. What about nonprofit, or has she? You may have to dig in on her LinkedIn just a little bit.
Yes. She was on the board for Genesis Works in the Bay Area.
Yeah, she was on that board. There are a couple of other specifically nonprofit. I forget if Genesis is for or non. Um, and you have to really kind of comb through because I think, she's put the 5,001 other boards that she's on on top. So it's like, we're just kind of like scrolling through it. Um, One of the nonprofits is pretty famous. So, well, at least out here, again, it's my Bay Area bias. Anybody else want to shout it out?
Is it the Silicon Valley Education Foundation that you're referring to?
That's one, yes. There's another one that's on there. So while somebody is looking that up, here's what you can do, and then I'm actually going to show my screen in a moment. Google Cisco Investor Relations. Now we're really going to have some fun. In fact, what I will do is make sure that I'm going to stop my share for a second. All right, let me move. See. Well, I think I could share this. All right, so does everybody see this? Okay. All right, so we're gonna hold on. I'm having a little challenge with my Zoom here.
Is she part of the Melinda of the Gates Foundation?
That I'm not sure. She might be. Hold on one more time. Let me give this another shot. I'm just gonna make sure I'm really on this page because I'm having a little bit of difficulty with this. Right, there we go. Okay. All right, so Cisco Investor Relations. So here's what we could do. So in case you have some difficulty finding this, all investor relation pages look a little bit different. What you typically want to do is go to the section called financial information. And if you notice here, we've got the section that's called SEC filings. So this is going to bring us to the proxy statement that I noted earlier. So we got this year and then all form types. So we go to proxy filings. Now, we don't have it for this year because it means they just haven't held their annual stockholders meeting yet. So let's go to the previous year and see what happens. All right, so the one I typically look at, because you have an amended one, but I look at the original, the DEF 14A. I think this is going to bring it up probably to the place where I had a bookmark last. Now we're really going to have some fun if it brings it up. There we go. All right. Let me minimize this and try to blow this up a little bit more. Okay. So hold on, let me minimize. Okay. All right. Here's Maria Martinez. Here's how much she made in 2024. What is that number?
That's a big number, $711,000. I'd like to make that salary.
Yeah, so it's particularly gigantic in 2024 because she retired. She left with 36 million. Most of that is stock awards.
Oh, wow.
Yes. But the previous year wasn't too shabby either. I mean, it was a lot less. It was only 15.1 million. But this is somebody that clearly has what a lot of people would call principal gift capacity. So we have a pretty good sense of our capacity with this particular. Again, not all prospects are as easy as this. But clearly this is somebody that has high capacity. And this, how do we find this? Just through Google search. So if everybody can take a deep breath after that. So I mentioned that there's actually two nonprofits that I saw on her LinkedIn. One is the Computer History Museum, which again is pretty well known out here. So you just kind of poke around, sometimes it's not altogether obvious where the donor rolls might be or the annual report, but I just kind of like to poke around on the site. So one, just sort of looking at it, explore, visit, probably not applicable. I mean, clearly we could see leadership, but I forget if she was on the board or not. I care less about that. I care about her giving. Let's go to donor recognition. All right. And CHM is supported by a network of visionaries, innovators, et cetera, et cetera. So we can scroll down. There's annual fund donors. There's Lifetime Giving Society. She wouldn't be, well, we're talking about the person, so we're not interested in institutional support. But if we poked around a little bit, does she fall under annual fund? So what I like to do is, of course, use the search function as frequently as possible. And we found that she has given at the level of 8,192 to 16,383. Very, very odd. Very, very odd in terms of a range, right? Ranges tend to be a bit more even than that. But she's given at this level. So she has given. Does anybody want to try and look up the Silicon Valley Education Foundation and see if you can find her giving? something in the chat. Okay, so see, Marissa said 10,000 to 24,999 gift range. I think that is likely correct. Let's see. If I can find. That looks to be correct. So yeah, if we look here, we kind of have to move this around a little bit, but she definitely falls under this range here, 10,000 to 24,999. So what we do know, right? Now we could Google even further. I'm probably gonna hold it off there just to make sure we have time for Q&A. But what we do know is that she has a very high capacity. The giving tends to be like in the sort of 5-figure range based off of what we could confirm. We could do further research, of course, and find that maybe she has an endowment, maybe at her alma mater or something like that. Maybe there's like a larger legacy gift, that type of thing. So there may be more giving there than what meets the eye. This is just for demonstration purposes. And the reason why I gave this particular example is because this is something that's very public. We're not digging into where she lives or any other more private information. But this is something that we can easily find, and it's a little bit of fun, sort of poking around and being able to understand just with a few Google searches what we can determine about a prospect's capacity and their giving. So all that was done in a matter of a couple of minutes. So yeah, not every prospect, of course, is as obvious as this one. But this does give us a sense of how we can use just very basic searches and free resources to do prospect research. So I'm going to wrap up with a few things here. Let's see. I think everybody can see this, right? Hopefully everybody can see the slide deck. So we've tried this out. Let's see. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about segmentation. The basic point of this is that, again, when we look at capacity, we have to take different strategies with our database, right? So obviously, if you have major gift prospects, there is a much more personalized process that you would have with your major gift prospects, as well as your board. Where if somebody is at an annual level, you may take a very more mass email type of approach, right? So what levels of engagement you're going to have are going to correspond to your different levels. So what you want to understand is the different segments in your database. Obviously everyone should be thanked and everyone should be stored, because I'm not saying certain gift sizes are more important than others. They're all important, but it just takes different strategies. You want to understand what are the different segments in your database once you start to do this research. Now, obviously your time's limited, right? So you have to think about prioritizing your research, perhaps. So if you want to have a better understanding of who's already in your database, obviously start with those that are giving, who are giving recently, consistently, who are your highest. Have some boosted their giving. If somebody's giving 500 one year, 1,000 the next, that's what we call positive velocity. So if somebody starts to boost their giving, they might actually be giving you signals that, hey, I'd like to have a little conversation with you. I would like to be giving more, but I'm not feeling the love. So you want to pay attention to those prospects that are starting to increase their giving and being very consistent. If you have some that are non-donors or maybe lapsed donors, you might want to look at those that are volunteers but are not giving. In some cases, you may know why. Maybe they have very limited capacity to give, and that's fine, right? But you might have ones that are responding to your emails if you are able to detect open rates, depending on what you're using, like Constant Contact or something else like that. If you have social media pages, and if you feel that this is appropriate for your organization, I've actually changed how I've referred to this, because I do know how this has become kind of a double-edged sword in terms of some organizations having a public presence and now being targeted. So if you feel that is an appropriate thing for your organization, that's something I would recommend. If you do have that presence, any people positively responding, but they're not giving, that might be a prospect you want to research and reach out to. Of course, leverage your board members, see who they can identify as connections that may have interest if they've not done so already. So, of course, if you want to hire somebody, you can contract a freelancer. There's a list that is provided on the Somos page of those that do freelance. Of course, we also have Pavel that has done freelance, as well as Carolyn, two of our key in-house resources. It's hard to provide an estimate because a lot of this depends on what you're asking to have done, and that's also influenced by where somebody lives. So I will tend to charge more because I live in Silicon Valley, and a dumpster costs $400,000 out here. So a freelancer again might be minimum 2,000, I think, for a project involving 50 hours. That might be a reasonable estimate, but check the Somos website and see if you can have an initial conversation with that freelancer. I also do freelance. I do have initial conversations as well with people and try to determine what their budget is and work within that. Train a staff member if you have that opportunity, or a volunteer. If you're close to a college, see if you can try to leverage that, like with an internship, and maybe have somebody that's really interested in doing research to help you out with this. You can always do it yourself. It takes time, but it does pay. And it's important to just be consistent in carving out that time. Anybody that, of course, does prospect research, I would say should sign a confidentiality agreement. And it's also really important to protect the donor privacy, because ultimately these are people as well, and you want to make sure that their information that they want to keep private should not go outside the organization. So just a couple of quick takeaways. So prospect research helps us to understand what capacity and inclination to give. It can help you identify prospects that could give far more to your nonprofit. There are free resources out there. There are more expensive resources out there. There are freelancers out there. It depends on what you have available, but it can be a very worthwhile investment for your nonprofit. And of course, the thing I always like to say is, when you do research, preserve it somewhere. Preserve it in your database. Make sure that's something that only people within your organization can access. But the research that you do, as well as the contacts that you have with your prospects, it's precious. Knowledge is money, knowledge is power, and it helps your nonprofit grow. So this is my contact information. Please contact me. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. I have posted this a lot. I've done this past couple of years. I have been working on a book. I will get this book out soon. I'm actually glad it is not out. I am modifying it to some degree, given our current context, in terms of some of the recommendations I have had for some of our peer organizations within Somos. But I promise it will be out at some point, and this will be at very low cost to Somos members. But other than that, I will stop. My share of my mouse works. There we go. And I'd like to open it up to any other questions you have. And don't overwhelm me with questions.
You're gonna get a LinkedIn request because you put it out there, so I hit go.
All right, cool.
To
Looking forward
connect.
to it.
But thank you. And also for sharing information about the freelancer. I'm literally having this conversation with the CEO right now. She's like, well, I'm not sure if we have. I'm like, she's like, it may be something for next year. I'm like, that's good. She's like, I want to spend all the resources that we have now before we get them. Like, but internally, I'm going, but this is an investment. It's not
Right.
wasting of money. This is an investment.
Right.
Please. So, any words of wisdom of how I can sell it to her, apart from it's an investment
Okay.
and worthwhile.
tell me a little bit more about your organization.
It's just we're small, and
Okay.
we're locked in with our budget. We've closed out our 25. Like, if it's not on the schedule, it's not gonna get done. So we're mean. We're doing it good, but um, I see the value of getting this research done now, so we can hit the ground running in 26. That's the Pavel. I'll be reaching out to you. Because if it's you start doing the research too late, you're already like starting the year off a foot behind, a step behind.
Yeah.
So we're gonna work on that.
Well, definitely sooner than later is important because, particularly if you have newer prospects to your organization, I think there's sometimes the expectation that, um, you have a list and then you're going to be able to raise funds dramatically within the course of a year. If they're cold to your organization, they're going to need some time to warm up. They're going to need some time to get to know you, to get to know your organization, to be cultivated in that sense. So, and if we're starting anew, we have to start with that foundation and then we have to give it that time. So the earlier you can do that, the better. Yeah, I know it's tricky because, I'm assuming we're talking about very, very limited budget at this point.
I will be trying to make magic happen
Yeah.
to make sure that we have enough so I could actually have a proposal and accept it.
Yeah, and I think
But it's
too.
gonna be a little bit of negotiation with one of my program directors.
All right. Well, I think too, it's like, who will ultimately manage it? Will it be you? Will it be somebody else?
And that's the thing. The thank you through the course and to Armando and the team of Somos and Pavel is that I was able to explain like the grants director, the person cannot be running development at the same time by themselves. It's just
Right.
not how it works. Like it's two separate gigs.
Yeah.
And so they've come around to the idea.
Well, and I think too, just to focus more on, the individual giving is going to be essential. I mean, grant makers already, you know, are kind of exhausted in some regard, and now even more so, given the cut in federal funding. So trying to figure out who are your individual champions is going to be really critical for everyone.
And I feel like
But
we're starting a step behind because we don't have this homework done. And we're gonna get to it. We're gonna get to it done.
but you're not alone. And
Yeah,
that's the
thank
other
you.
thing. It's kind of interesting because I think there are, you know, how old is your organization, if I might
We're turning
ask?
5.
5. All right. Well, happy birthday. And
Thank you. We're youngins in the field to a certain degree. So.
you sometimes find something very similar with organizations that have been around 30, 40 years. It's kind of an interesting, unfortunate point that we're in because now we're also facing all this restriction on funding. But not that the story is just more amplified than what it has been. You know, government funding in particular has always been a challenge. It's dependent on, the administration that is in power, right? So those have been relying on government funding and grant making and so forth. You see in organizations as young as yours, and those have been around 40 years.
Oh, okay.
So it's this moment where we really have to sort of coalesce our power. This is really, I think, part of it's La Lucha that's always been happening. This is just another chapter of it.
Thank you.
Pavel, I think, have we run over time? I don't recall.
I think we're good. So yeah.
Can I throw it out for at least one more? Oh, I'm not reading the chat. Let me read the chat. Okay, Lily, you're welcome. Okay, so Karina had said, I was considering giving this task to an intern, but I'm not sure how successful that will be. We get an intern every summer for about 8 weeks. I feel like they'll spend most of their time trying to figure out rather than producing real work product. Any suggestions? Well, first and foremost, everybody gets a copy of the slides and the recording. The slides I'm going to give you. So one of the ways to start out with, I would say, is to actually read through these slides. That could be helpful. I could also, again, I'm trying to coalesce all the different resources that are out there. I plan on working on a website of my own at some point, along with the book, to try to make these resources a lot more publicly available. I'm part of an organization called APR, although you have to be a member of it. But I could provide that information. They do have some reduced memberships for APR, which provides all sorts of advice about how to do prospect research. And so again, I'll try to coalesce a number of different resources that can be made available to everyone, where you can learn more about this process. While I'm blanking, there's a Helen Brown group that also provides a lot of free information.
Yeah.
Prospect Research Institute is yet another that provides some free information. But I mean, there are some online resources that are free. They're low cost, and you can also learn about this. Again, my book will make it out eventually, and now that I'm an empty nester, I may actually have time to finish it. So, those are just some off-the-cuff suggestions. Any last questions? Right. Well, if that is all, I'd like to thank you all for, oh, one more? Is that applause or a hand up? I can't tell these emojis. Okay, well, I think that's it. Thank you so much. And again, contact me if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you all.
Thank
Right,
Have a
you
good
too.
well, good afternoon, not evening.
Bye.